portion of the U.S. Portion of the Red River Basin on the Minnesota side of the basin. Relative to where we're at today, Climax, you can see on the map, is the outlet for the Sandhill River, about 30 miles south of where we sit today. So just to give you some context of where we sit in the world, of where the watershed is located. The watershed district itself oversees drainage for multiple drainage systems within the area in the yellow that you see there. They also oversee permitting and have regulatory authority over water management issues within the area that you see there. Also multiple jurisdictions and stakeholders involved. All the red lines are public drainage systems that are under the authority of various counties, as well as the dashed blue lines, which are the drainage systems that are under the authority of the Sandhill Watershed District. But the system that we're going to talk about today and that we're kind of going through a planning process right now is a system that we refer to as the Sandhill Ditch, or essentially it's a channelized portion of the Sandhill River. So just a little bit of background on what that project actually was. It's something that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers began planning in the 1940s, I believe, is when planning started on it. They kind of worked through the planning process and then came forward with this project to channelize the Sandhill River to remove wet floodplain areas and provide for development or settlement of this region for agricultural purposes. So that project was completed in about 1955, and really at that time, the main purpose of that was to provide drainage for an area within kind of the Red River Basin that was largely wet meadow, a lot of kind of expansive, undefined floodplain. You see it hatched there in the blue as an approximate extent. What that's showing is what's assumed to be the pre-settlement condition of being kind of wet meadow area in that region. And the purpose of the project was largely to provide drainage for that area. And should also state, there were decades of trying to provide drainage for this area through different judicial and state ditch systems, and there just wasn't a lot of success until this project was implemented in the mid-1950s. So what that's left us with today is a lot of that blue area was actually, now it's highly productive agricultural ground. A lot of row crops, a lot of sugar beet production occurs within this region. Also, the Sandhill ditch system itself now is a kind of a major fixture in water management within the Sandhill River watershed. So the ditch system serves as the primary outlet for roughly 2/3 of the watershed district. So essentially all the area that you see highlighted in purple on the screen is land area that now drains through the Sandhill ditch system. So not only is it providing drainage benefit for those agricultural producers out there, it's also an important component for the watershed district because it serves now as the outlet for the watershed itself. So one thing to point out, hopefully the drone video is moving awful quick here, but when the project was completed, there were a lot of issues that were encountered almost immediately after completion. The project was constructed through what's known as the beach ridge of the Red River Basin. Steeper slopes, lighter soils led to pretty massive channel incision and down cutting. In a lot of areas in this particular reach that you're seeing on the screen here, there's been down cutting on the order of 8 to 12 feet from the original design gradient. You can imagine along with that incision, pretty major bank instabilities have occurred as well. So you can see on the screen lots of bank sloughing occurring. There's actually a township road on the side of the channel there. Not used very much until it needs use. I'm sure a lot of you can relate, but it's a critical component during spring planting, harvest time of year to get the crops on and off of the field. There's been a lot of issues, and again, similar to some of the aerial photos that Jim had, scale is tough to gauge here, but many of these kind of these shelves from these sloughs are in the order of 10 to 15 feet or more of vertical drop, essentially. So pretty massive the amount of erosion that's occurred out there, and it's continuing to occur out there. So in addition to the erosion, we do have, despite all the drainage systems, there are still issues with flooding, particularly in the springtime within the Sandhill watershed. What you're seeing on the screen is a 10-year flood event. You kind of see on the western portion of the map, pretty massive amounts of inundation. So what we see happen, some of it's been exacerbated by having this channel incision and continually having more and more channelized flow. We have increased occurrence of breakout flows further downstream from there. Those breakout flows then move overland, jeopardize infrastructure, some homes and things like that in the landscape, cause lots of erosion damage as the overland flow moves, and eventually kind of gets carried back into either the sandhill or one of the other drainage systems out there. So in response to that, the watershed district has been working on what can we do with the funding that we have to try and fix the issue. And a lot of credit goes out to the West Polk SWCD, the Sandhill Watershed District. They really came together on a collaborative effort here, working with a lot of outside funding partners to make it happen. But through the last, I would say 2016 through 2020, there were about 34 grade control structures installed along the steepest portions of the channel. So what those look like, you can see a picture, kind of we call them rock riffles, but essentially little check dams to help control the grade line within the channel itself. So 34 of those were built at all the dots that you can see along the alignment of the Sandhill Ditch. And then also the Corps of Engineers came in through their 1135 process and kind of retrofit some of the larger concrete drop structures that were a feature of the project back in 1950 to these what we kind of call rock arch rapids to facilitate fish passage. You can see a screenshot of that on the slide as well. So those projects were accomplished. They've done a lot of good. We think that we've really slowed the amount of channel incision through those projects, but one of the main issues we have is those bank instabilities. You know, that they're already failing, so we're still dealing with highly unstable banks, and we've seen that particularly in the spring of 2020, 2021. We had pretty large spring flows through the channel, and that resulted in continued bank failure along the Sandhill Ditch. So what the watershed decided to do in 2023 was we moved into a project team planning process. So those of you that aren't familiar with the project team process in Minnesota, it can really generally be summarized as an interagency and stakeholder approach to developing projects. So we try and have regulatory authorities, landowners, potential funding partners, those that would be impacted by the project, all sit around the table together to help develop what the solution may look like. That group then comes with a recommendation that can be considered by the watershed board to carry forward as a project. So some of you might also be wondering, okay, the Sandhill Ditch is one of your legal drainage systems. Why are you not just handling this through maintenance of the system? You know, ditch systems in the state of Minnesota do have tax levy authority, and why wouldn't we be using those funds? And really what it comes down to is just the practical ability to fund the scale of solutions that are required to fix the problem. That very similar to what Jim talked about, the reality of how much you can reasonably tax just didn't generate sufficient funds to be able to correct the issue that exists out there. So you can see a few different reasons listed there, but that's really the large reason as to why a project team process was selected for this. So for the objectives of the project team and really what the watershed board wants to see come out of the project team process, there's pretty detailed objectives on the screen, but really what we want to be able to do is correct some of those bank instability issues out there that are causing encroachments on private ground, public safety concerns at road crossings and adjacent roads, some of the breakout flows that happen further downstream. And then we also want to use the project team as a platform so we can look at some of these other opportunities that exist, things like water quality enhancements, reducing erosion, providing for some recreational opportunities if it exists, and how can we kind of build that into one large package. And you can see on the far side of the slide over there, in general, that's the process, is meet the local objectives, incorporate natural resource enhancement benefits as we're able, and hopefully we can use that to develop a funding package that we can address multiple interests and get to some real solutions on the ground for the watershed district. So in general, what that process looks like, the graphic you can see on the slide here, as we talked about, quite a bit of effort through the project team process goes into defining what the problems and the objectives are. From there, and that's really where we are in the process right now, is then we move into developing what those alternatives would look like. So that's really kind of an iterative process. We come up with an idea, you run it through some of the models, maybe look at what would be impacted, then go and refine that to try and avoid maybe any of those impacts and so forth, until you arrive at something that the project team is comfortable with. Ultimately, the idea is to get to a recommended alternative that is locally acceptable, addresses the problem, and is permittable. So that's kind of the goal of the process that we're trying to go through and get to an alternative that the watershed district board can then consider to go forward with establishing a formal project. So now, after all that background, we'll get into kind of the meat of what I wanted to talk about today, and that's how do we incorporate resiliency into this planning effort. So where this all started with the Sandhill River Watershed District and the project that we're talking about today was a funding source that's made available through the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. It's called the Local Climate Action Grant. I'm sure all you guys are aware and hear about it, but resiliency for infrastructure is definitely a hot topic federally and at the state level. That's translated into funding opportunities for those type of activities. So Minnesota Pollution Control Agency in the state of Minnesota is one such agency that provides quite a bit of funding for these type of activities. So the Watershed District secured a grant. Largely it's a planning grant just last year here in 2024. Generally what we're trying to get through there is to assess what the future condition looks like from a meteorologic and hydrologic standpoint. Compare that to the existing conditions, develop design recommendations, incorporate that into the design, ultimately getting to a more resilient project moving forward for the Watershed District and its constituents. So in general, we are still on the early phases of this, so we have not gone through the detailed analyses of trying to estimate changes in precipitation. I just want to highlight through this effort that this is not a quote-unquote climate change study. Really, we're not trying to diagnose why things are changing or anything like that. Our main purpose is to look at trends in the data and make an educated or informed decision on looking forward in terms of what precipitation volumes and precipitation intensities may look like, then use that information to develop design recommendations. So again, back to the project. We're talking about the Sandhill Ditch, which is the red and yellow dashed line on the screen. The way this will look as we get into this is, in the Sandhill watershed, we're fortunate that we have some pretty sophisticated modeling capabilities, as with most of the Red River Basin. So we have hydrologic models, which you see on the screen here. The orange and black boundary areas represent subbasins, and the blue lines are reach routing, or essentially how the flow is routed downstream. So we'll take that future hydrologic condition, use this model to estimate flow timing, intensity, and duration. We'll then put that into a hydraulic model that's available that'll allow us to take that flow information and convert it into things like stage, breakout flows, velocities. And then from that, we can then take that information and use that to develop design recommendations to have a more resilient project going forward, whether it's bigger components, additional armoring or things like that to protect from erosion. But that's kind of the approach and the end goal here through this grant. Touched on this a little bit already, but our general goal is to stepping through these different pieces here is just to get to a recommended alternative with resiliency in mind, and ultimately getting to an alternative that has lower operation and maintenance costs for the district looking forward into the future. So we're not just designing for today, but hopefully we're putting something on the ground that's suitable for what conditions will be through the life of the project. So from the project team process, what this generally does is just adds one more step into our alternative analysis. So in addition to looking at these impacts, we're also going to be looking at, well, how does this fit within the future conditions, hydrology, and how is it resilient to those conditions? So really just adds one more step. It seems to fit pretty well within our current established project team process. So again, that's kind of the hope that we're looking for, is to use the project team as a platform to get to design features for consideration of resiliency. So just moving forward here, and then we'll wrap things up. But really the next steps, you see them listed on the screen, but the most important piece there is we have to get through the project team process. So we're working through that right now. Like I mentioned, we're kind of very early in the alternative development standpoint, but we'll continue working through that. Our goal is in 2025 to bring a recommendation to the Watershed Board for consideration. Assuming they go forward with establishing a formal watershed project, then we would move into develop and pursue the funding package. One thing I would just make note of is by going through this resiliency planning effort, we'll also have a resiliency, we'll have all the documentation as to why decisions were made. And we feel that that document also is going to help us be more competitive when it comes to trying to secure outside funding sources, may open up additional sources as well. So once we kind of know what we're going to do and how we're going to pay for it, then we'll kind of move into more of the traditional engineering and construction tasks. So final design, permitting, construction, ultimately getting to the operation and maintenance phase. And hopefully through these resiliency practices that we'll put into the project, that'll lead to a project where that operation and maintenance is much more less cost prohibitive for the district moving forward. So with that, that about wraps up what I have. Again, I just want to say thank you to the Basin Commission for the opportunity, the Santo River Watershed District for working with us through the project, and thank you guys all for your time.